I am the executive director of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. We're located on the campus at Trinity. We're a research center, and we're a resource for you. A solid 1/3 of our mission of what I see us doing is providing help and resources to pastors and church leaders. And so we get phone calls, emails all the time from pastors who find themselves in situations that are perplexing, that are difficult, that are challenging, that we can help with. I mean, we can't help with all of them. But for example, we got a call a couple of years ago now from a pastor who had a couple in his church, and they had been told that the child that the wife was carrying was not going to survive till birth. And if it did, would only live for a few hours at most. And so, of course, the medical advice is simply have an abortion now, get this over with. And we were able, he's like, what do I tell him? I've never had this happen. We were able to connect him and the family with perinatal hospice that could come in, help these parents prepare for what was going to happen, give this child every moment of life that it could have, celebrate the life, grieve the losses, and really be a ministry to them. So when you find yourselves in these kind of situations, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we will do what we can to be of assistance. I'm going to talk a little bit today about our bodies, about the goodness of our bodies, of our embodiment. If you'd like to hear more on that, I'm going to be speaking at the North Central District Conference in April at New Hope Church, and I'll be doing a thing on a breakout session on gender confusion. And so some of the setup is the same, but we go in very different directions. You can see here on the handout, I just decided to go ahead and give away my big point right here at the beginning. My request is that I ask each of you to personally come to a prayerful conviction on the issue of birth control, particularly hormonal birth control and reproductive technologies, particularly IVF. So that's kind of step one, and I'll offer some more steps. But I feel like if everyone comes away from this and you have a strong personal conviction on these issues, that we will have been successful here today. And of course, I want you to do more than that, but that's kind of my starting point. The other thing, which I did not put on here, but I do feel strongly about, is some of the ways we talk about this. I think oftentimes we talk about starting a family. Single people are a family of one. A married couple, that's a family. They have started a family. What we're talking about today is family building. And I think that really can make a difference to your listeners, to know that you acknowledge the single people as families, that you acknowledge the couples without children as families, and that, yes, people seek to build onto those families. So if you go away with either one of those, I've won. So 3 topics today. They require some careful thought, sensitivity, nuance. So I pray that we do well with these things today. As I said, the Bible has much to say about the body. Each of these topics has to do with not only our own bodies, the bodies of ourselves and our spouse, but embryonic bodies, fetal bodies. How do we think about them? How do we treat them? What are the right and wrong things to do regarding them? Psalm 139, a familiar passage, this very beautiful poem about our development. Consider that this was written in a clearly pre-scientific age. I mean, now we have, National Geographic has video of this and animations of this, but this is David's poetic imagination here. You created my inmost being. You knit me together. Just think about the fine, detailed work that's involved in careful knitting. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together, there's that poetic imagery again of being woven together. You think of a loom and think of the intricate and delicate patterns that can be made through weaving on a loom. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And of course, in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians, do you not know that your bodies are the temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. How do we honor God with our bodies when it comes to building a family? And then finally, Romans 12:2, and I think this really applies in a couple of different ways. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And then do not conform to the pattern of this world. And I think what I see so much in evangelical circles is that we're just completely conformed to the pattern of the world when it comes to things like birth control, when it comes to things like reproductive technologies. Or as I put it on the handout, avoiding pregnancy and achieving pregnancy. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And of course, there are other scriptures we could consider as we get started here about how God works all things together for good. And we don't say that flippantly. We don't say that reflexively. I mean, when we brush up against infertility, this is really painful. But it is a deep truth, a core belief of ours that somehow God works in even those difficult, painful things for our good and for his glory. And of course, the incarnation affirms, among many things, the goodness of our human embodiment, that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, took on a human body, lived on this earth, went through minutes and hours and days and weeks and months in exactly the same way that we do, in a bodily life, an embodied life. Nancy Pearcey writes, our view of the body, and I would suggest our view of fertility, depends on our view of nature. Do we see nature as essentially good, a gift from the Creator to be accepted with gratitude? Or do we see nature as a set of negative limitations to be controlled and conquered? And I think we could substitute the word fertility for nature. So do we see our fertility as essentially good, a gift from the Creator to be accepted with gratitude? Or do we see our fertility as a set of negative limitations to be controlled and conquered? And of course, we engage in diet and exercise and other things for our health, but this is out of a sense of stewardship, not out of a sense of domination or domineering of our bodies. So what do I want to leave you here with today? Well, let's talk about family building instead of starting a family. I've already mentioned coming to a prayerful conviction on these matters. And then once you've done that, I want to challenge you to make that known to your congregation. I want you to use that, as John already mentioned, in your premarital counseling. What you want is for people in your congregation to know that they can come to you about these matters, that these matters matter to your church, they matter to you. And again, if you get stuck, you get a question that you don't know how to answer, you can come to us, and then I'll go to other experts, and we'll help you out with that. So if we don't talk about these issues in our church, the people in our churches won't think that they're important to us. They won't think that the church has anything to say on these things. And that's just wrong. We do have things to say on that. So the blessing of children. First of all, it's undeniable that children are prominent in Scripture. Genesis 1:28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And then in Psalm 127, again, a familiar passage, children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be put to shame when they contend with their opponents in court. So we're pro-natal, but not at any cost. But we're pro-natal in the midst of a culture that's, I think, increasingly anti-natal, anti-children, very much focused on career and jobs and success and freedom, autonomy. I want to travel. I don't want to be tied down. I want to have my time for me. These are the messages of our culture, and so it's increasingly countercultural to be pro-natal. So birth control, avoiding pregnancy. It was interesting in studying for this and preparing for our time together today how few people today are writing about the issue of birth control. You really have to look a bit longer and a bit harder than I thought I would have to find good writing on the issue of birth control. And then you find the one person that's writing a lot about it. But I really, there were a couple of books that I looked at that really, there was no chapter headings, there were no subheadings, there was nothing in the index on contraception, on birth control, anything. And it really surprised me. And I think maybe there's probably several reasons. One, it's controversial. And not everybody loves controversy. Some people love it too much, but not everybody loves controversy. And then second of all, I think there are just ways in which we are simply conformed to the world. That, of course, you go on the pill right before you get married. That's just what you do. And so I really want to challenge that view today. Now, of course, there are medical reasons why a woman might be taking hormonal birth control. And there are financial and prudential matters of wisdom why a couple might forego having children for a time, for right now. But this default assumption that we spend most of our married lives avoiding having children, I think is mistaken and misguided, or at very least calls for reconsideration. You'll note in the notebook three books that I recommended by bibliography. I wish I had added Greg Allison's book. It's called Embodied. Greg Allison's a professor at Southern Seminary. This is a very good book on our embodiment, broadly speaking. I've used parts of it in talking about gender confusion issues, but he deals with much more than that with the body. One of the things that he mentions in the book is that there are multiple purposes for sexual activity. It joins two people together in a one flesh unity. It may result in procreation, bringing into existence new life. It's intended for a couple's pleasure, sense of fulfillment. It leads to their flourishing. And it may provide comfort through physical closeness. So unity, procreation, pleasure, and comfort. These are all valuable parts of our sexual lives or our sexual experience. And so there are, a whole variety of different forms of birth control. Just to talk plainly, the IUD, I think, is completely out of bounds for a Christian couple. The whole purpose of the IUD is to keep an embryo from implanting in the uterus. So you know that the embryo has formed, and the IUD keeps it from latching on, from taking hold within the uterus. I mean, it is destructive of life. The hormonal birth control pills, there are lots of unknowns about the action of the hormonal birth control pill. And they're also implantable, so I'm using hormonal more broadly than just the pill. One of the articles on the handout, and I didn't put the URLs because who's going to type that out? Your best bet is just to Google these. They'll come right up if you Google the author and title. But the one, C. Ryan Fields, The Christian and Oral Contraceptives, an Investigation into Moral Permissibility. That's a little bit longer article. It's a little bit more academic, but he goes through and looks at kind of the knowns and the unknowns. The problem is there's nobody with the financial means who has a financial interest in answering the questions about the hormonal birth control pill. So its action is supposed to be that it stops ovulation. So the release of an egg, no egg gets released, a woman can't get pregnant, no embryo can form. Of course, there is breakthrough ovulation, that does occur. So the question is, does the pill also ruin the lining of the uterus such that any embryo that forms can't implant? And no one knows. There are breakthrough pregnancies, and so there are definitely cases where an egg breaks through and it does implant. And so it's just an unknown. It's just an unknown. And Dr. Fields does a very good job in that article of parsing through the ethics of that, decision-making in the midst of the unknown. Ethical decision-making in the midst of the unknown is really the question there. And so I really commend that article to your reading. I think that there are plenty of good questions to be asked. And again, there are reasons why a woman might take hormonal birth control beyond birth control. There are other medical reasons why. But that is I think ultimately, and as the article indicates, I think ultimately that it is a matter of conscience, but conscience that's well-informed and well-formed. One that thinks about whether or not our fertility is a good gift from our Creator or whether our fertility is a negative limitation to be overcome. Yes, a question.
So the pill's been around for 65 years or so. Nobody's done a study on its, or, I mean, am I hearing you right?
There have been some studies, but it remains an unanswered question whether or not it ruins the lining of the uterus in such a way that an embryo can't implant.
Is there concern that that might be the case?
Yes, that is the concern, okay. Yeah. But it's just not known. And the only people who have enough money to really study that are the birth control pill makers. Yeah, and they have absolutely no financial interest in finding out the answer to that question. Yeah, yeah. But we make ethical decisions in the midst of unknowns all the time. It's difficult. It needs to be done prayerfully. It needs to be done with full information. And then I think ultimately it is a matter of conscience. But I really think we need to, one of the things we need to think very long and hard about is the one flesh union. I think our Catholic brothers and sisters are onto something with their emphasis on the one flesh union. And just as evangelicals generally, as Protestants generally, we have not done a good job of thinking about our bodies. We do tend to be a bit Gnostic. And this is one area where the rubber really meets the road. And the gender issues are another. And I think if we had a better grip on our own view of our embodiment and our own view of what it means to be an embodied creature, to be in a marital relationship, that we might think differently about some of these issues. There are barrier methods, and this would be without much controversy at all: spermicides, diaphragms, things that if the two never meet, then there's no conception. I mean, they're truly contraceptives. And then there are natural methods, and I didn't write it on the handout, but I meant to. But I'll give you some more information about, because it ends up being both for avoiding pregnancy and for achieving pregnancy, but it's called the Creighton method. And it is born out of the natural family planning of the Catholic Church. But it's really aimed at whole health and total health. I mean, a lot of the things that we do are unhealthy. And I think there are things in our environment that are inescapably unhealthy. I mean, we hear about nanoplastics now. I just don't know how we're going to avoid some of this stuff. But to whatever degree we can be focused on our total health, that is a help to fertility, and it can be a help to birth control. It's the same spelling, yeah. It's often abbreviated. Let me get this right. CRMS, the Creighton model, or CRMS. So I don't really have a lot more to say about birth control other than let's really think about our embodiment. Let's really take into consideration a larger picture than this is just what the culture does, this is just what everybody does. I think another thing we need to emphasize with folks, probably in our premarital counseling especially, is to have children sooner rather than later. Fertility declines. You can hear a little bit about that in the mainstream media, but you don't hear a lot about it, but it radically declines over time, as do energy levels for raising children. But, if you pursue careers, you pursue degrees, and you get all of your school debt paid off, and you get your home purchased, and you get your cars purchased, you're running up against your biological clock. And that's something to think about sooner rather than later. But I do want to move to achieving pregnancy, the opposite of avoiding pregnancy. This is a very interesting way of grouping topics. Thanks, Greg. And to start with, the verse I always start with is in Proverbs chapter 30. Just imagine with me, just the word picture here. There are 3 things that are never satisfied, 4 that never say enough. The grave, the barren womb, the land which is never satisfied with water, and fire, which never says enough. Just think about those word pictures, the womb right in the middle of that, the grave. People keep dying every day. Cemeteries, if not filling up, at least filling out. I lived in California for 10 years. The land never satisfied with water. We had that all over the place, except when we had the fires, right? That never went out. And then the occasional, like they had last week, 12 inches of rain in one day where the land just slides down the hill.
Okay.
What's that?
We're good.
Yeah. And right in the middle of this, the barren womb, infertility. As John mentioned, we're looking at what statistics range from 10 to 20%, 10, 12, 20% of couples will struggle with infertility.
Can I ask why? Because that seems historically like a very high number. So what's going on?
Well, the delay of pregnancy is a big piece of it. Infertility is defined as, let me give you the official definition here, a disease or condition of the reproductive system diagnosed after a couple has had 1 year of unprotected, well-timed intercourse, or 6 months if the woman is over 35, or if a woman has multiple miscarriages. So the aging is definitely a factor in that. And then there may be environmental reasons as well. Many women, and I'm hoping this is on the decrease, but many women have trouble with endometriosis, which is a condition where the tissue that lines the uterus grows everywhere in the abdomen. It's extremely painful. It makes conception extremely difficult because one of the things it does is it grows between the fallopian tubes and clogs them up so that if and when the egg is released, it doesn't flow into the uterus, and so it's never able to be fertilized. And there is some evidence that endometriosis has a link to a morning sickness pill that many women took in the 50s and 60s. So us kind of early Gen Xers, there are many early Gen Xer women who have endometriosis that may be connected to drugs that their mothers took for morning sickness. Maybe.
Is there a connection to STDs and maybe previous abortions?
Yes, both of those things can definitely affect fertility. Yeah, both STDs and previous abortion. But infertility is an old problem. Does anyone know how many accounts of infertility there are in the Bible? And then we will go through and name them.
Oh my goodness. Hannah?
Yes?
Sarah.
Yes?
Rachel.
Right?
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes? That's 4. Samson, yes, that's another one. Manoah and his wife.
Oh, okay. Elizabeth.
Elizabeth and Zachariah, yep. Oh, there's only one more, so there's 7. Somebody said Samson's parents. 2 Kings. The Shunammite woman. The Shunammite woman. Yep. Yeah, so there's 7 accounts in the scriptures starting in Genesis. So this is an old problem. It's not new. So 15 to 20% of couples deal with infertility. In about 35% of the cases, it's a female factor, so it might be endometriosis. It could be some kind of birth problem. It can be a hormonal problem. About 35% of the time, it's a male factor. Low sperm count, low motility, injury, all sorts of things. About 20% of the time, it's some combination, that these two people just don't work well together, or neither one of them work all that well. I had a good friend that I worked for when I was in college, and the doctors told them, yeah, neither one of you are fertile. This is just never going to work. And they had 2 adopted children, but and then in about 10% of the cases, it's just unexplained. They just don't have any idea why it won't work. And if you really look at how everything has to be in the right place at the right time in the right conditions, it kind of is a miracle that it ever works. And so yeah, it's about half male, half female, half combined, or 10% combined, and 10% unexplained. It's also important to acknowledge the pain of secondary infertility. I have a good friend, she had 3 children, and they really wanted a 4th, and it took them several years. Some of my best friends, they have one daughter that it was difficult to have the first pregnancy, and they've not had a second pregnancy in 15 years of trying. So secondary infertility can be just as painful, and it's easy, people look at them and go, well, you have a child, shouldn't you be happy with that? But that's not the right kind of attitude to have at all. There are 6 losses that come with infertility, and each of these needs to be grieved on its own. So the loss of control. I mean, you just expect you get married, this is going to work, this is how things go. There's the loss of genetic continuity. People want to have a child that is from them, that's from their body, that is in line with the family tree. The loss of a jointly conceived child. I want to have a child with my spouse. That's the product of the 2 of us. The loss of pregnancy and birth experiences, and not just showers and things like that, but feeling the baby move, having the stomach grow, giving birth, going through that situation. There are a whole host of emotional expectations about, yes, the pregnancy and birth experiences, but what it'll be like to have a child, playing catch, going to see them at recitals, walking them down the aisle at their wedding. There's all of these expectations around childbearing that are lost in infertility. And then finally, the opportunity to parent a new generation, to be part of the next generation, of seeing them, launching them out into the world. Adoption addresses only one of these, and that's the ability or the opportunity to parent a new generation. These other things are still lost. The genetic connection, the opportunity to see your child that came from your body, walk down the aisle, go to school. And so adoption is a great thing. I mean, it really is. But sometimes infertility and adoption are linked together in ways that I think is unhealthy, that doesn't allow people to grieve fully each of these losses. Oh, you can just adopt is an easy shortcut. And I want to suggest that that's too easy a shortcut. Infertility is painful. It really needs to be acknowledged as painful. It comes with a lot of loss. And we do couples a disservice when we don't allow them to grieve each of these losses on their own. And then yes, they may separately consider adoption, and certainly we would want to encourage them, help them with that in any way that we could, but only after giving them the time and the space to grieve this full measure of loss. Other things to be attuned to when it comes to infertility is miscarriage. The anniversary of miscarriages can often be very, very painful for people. Miscarriage is much more common than most people think. My wife had a miscarriage, and we were just shocked at the number of other women in our church who'd had miscarriages. It's just not something that comes up in routine. By the way, did you know? So be aware of those losses and be aware of those anniversaries and the pain that comes with that. Even for women who go on to have many other children, some women have miscarriages in between children, and these are difficult losses for them. Leon Cass, who was the chairman of the President's Council on Bioethics 20 years ago, in one of his books, he writes, "Consider the views of life and the world reflected in the following different expressions that describe the process of generating new life. Ancient Israel, impressed with the phenomenon of transmission of life from father to son, used the word we translate as begetting or siring. The Greeks, impressed with the springing forth of new life in the cyclical process of generation and decay, called it genesis, from a root meaning to come into being. The pre-modern Christian English-speaking world, impressed with the world as a given by the Creator, used the term procreation. And we, impressed with the machine and the gross national product, our work of creation, employ the metaphor of the factory, reproduction, begetting, siring, genesis, procreation, reproduction. How easy is it for us to fall into those patterns of seeing infertility, fertility simply as reproduction, the process of our own creation, of our own making. What do we lose when we move from begetting to siring to Genesis to procreation to reproduction? How do those shift our thinking, the mental model that we have of what's going on? And then what do we lose when we start making life in the laboratory? Take it out of the body entirely. Are we simply going with the larger culture? Did you know that it is now possible for a child to have 5 parents? Sperm donor, egg donor, surrogate, rearing mother or social mother, rearing father or social father. It's now not only possible, but increasingly common, unfortunately, for situations like that to arise. There are somewhere between 38 and 40 ways to make a baby. And it's a veritable alphabet soup. IUI, AID, ICSI, IVF, and so on and so forth. Increasingly, though, the choices or the options that are offered are somewhat limited. Usually, if a couple is having infertility, the first stop is fertility drugs that try to time and ensure the release of an egg. Then sometimes they'll move on to artificial insemination to make sure that the sperm and the egg are actually meeting. And then very quickly, it tends to move on to IVF. In fact, many times it just goes straight to IVF. There are other options that people will employ: donor eggs and sperm, surrogacy I mentioned a little bit, and then embryo adoption. Any of these that bring in third parties are terribly problematic for Christians. So surrogacy, donor eggs, donor sperm, just don't bring third parties into your relationships. These also are commercial transactions, surrogacy in particular. I've actually made 3 documentary films on surrogacy, and the plight that the surrogates go through. Kim Kardashian, for example, has used a surrogate. Kim Kardashian has not been a surrogate for anyone. There is a huge class issue at work in surrogacy. Huge. Surrogacy is an international, it's now transnational is the term for it. It's now an international business. In fact, the last film I was involved in, we titled it #BigFertility because of the monumental amounts of money that are involved in it. And I mean, not to get all Marxist, but capital can move freely, labor cannot. And so India was a hotbed of surrogacy until the Indian government said, no. You're not coming in here and using our women as surrogates. So then it moved to Nepal. Giant earthquake in Nepal. Lots of gay couples flew in and got the babies out of the hospital, left the surrogate mothers in the hospital. Or what was left of the hospital. Then it moved to Cambodia, moved to Mexico. Huge class issues when it comes to surrogacy.
Do I dare to ask, what does the surrogate mother get for carrying a baby like that?
First time, $25,000 to $30,000. Somebody who's done it 2 or 3 times, $50,000 to $75,000 plus expenses. Military wives is probably one of the largest cohesive groups in the United States. Enlisted men, they don't make a ton of money in the military. And so military wives, they're very pro-family. It's not unusual to see pregnant women married to military men, so fewer questions are asked. And it's a huge supplement to their income. As of 2021, the last year for which statistics are available, 2.3% of all infants born in the United States and Puerto Rico were conceived with artificial reproductive technologies like IVF. 2.3% of all children. Gratefully, they have moved more towards single embryo transfer. And sometimes you'll hear that called implantation. I mean, the hope is it will implant, but it is technically transfer. We used to have those cases where they would implant or they would transfer. Let's see, I even did it. They would transfer 3 or 4 embryos, and then if all 4 of them began to grow, then they would want to do a selective reduction, which is an abortion of 1 or 2 of them to make room. That trend has gratefully fallen away. A greater percentage of infants conceived through reproductive technologies like IVF are low birth weight. So about 15% of IVF babies are low birth weight or born before 37 weeks of pregnancy. So it's about 19%. And in the general population, those numbers are 8.5% and 10.5%. So the numbers are quite a bit higher for reproductive technology babies. So you're putting children in risk. There's a friend of mine, Katie Faust, out in Washington State, has an organization called Them Before Us, and she is really doing great work focusing in on the children. So the children that are born through surrogacy, the children that are born through these reproductive technologies, and particularly looking, well, not particularly, but in addition, looking at children then who are placed in families that are not intact. So single women by choice who use reproductive technologies, and of course, gay male couples. And she's done all the heavy lifting, all the deep digging on the statistics of how children fare in such households, and not just these health effects, but the developmental effects and other things. There are really serious questions to be raised about whether any of this reproductive technology stuff is good for children. As Christians, though, we want to think about a theology of infertility. First of all, children are prominent in Scripture, and we covered that earlier. It is God who opens and shuts the womb. 1 Samuel 1, the story of Hannah, because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. And in Romans 8, again, this is not something flippant. This is a core conviction that I consider our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us, that somehow God works even in the worst of our present sufferings. And that prayer is a proper response to infertility. And there in 1 Samuel 1, a very familiar passage of Hannah's prayer, really pouring out her heart before the Lord to a degree that the priest thought that she was drunk. But no, she was just pouring out her heart to the Lord. Some practical issues when it comes to IVF. What do we believe about the moral status of human embryos? Those embryos that are formed in the lab. The issue of cryopreservation. IVF is expensive, as you no doubt know. And so what they will want to do is retrieve as many eggs as possible, and there are some nasty side effects to the egg retrieval process. It is a surgical procedure. They'll want to retrieve as many eggs as possible, and they'll want to fertilize as many of those as possible. They also get into grading of embryos, selecting the ones that they think are the best embryos, which is shades of eugenics. They, as I said, are not doing the huge multiple transfers anymore, so they will want to freeze some for later. Many embryos do not survive the freeze-thaw cycle. So what do we believe about the status of the human embryo?
A quick question on that.
Yeah.
Do you have a percentage for like how many survive versus how many don't?
The thaw, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. No, I don't. It's less than 50%. It's probably 20, 25% don't survive the freeze-thaw process.
But then that would tell you intuitively, then if that's the case, then you're also going to have a high percentage of birth defects.
That's possible.
Overrepresented.
There is a slight overrepresentation of birth defects, of developmental difficulties, and I think there's been some speculation about autism, but I don't know that there's been real rigorous studies done on that. Carter Sneed, that's probably another book I should have put on here. Carter Sneed is just finishing his term as the director of the DeNicholas Center for Ethics at Notre Dame. He was the general counsel. He's an attorney. He was the general counsel to the President's Council on Bioethics 20 years ago. There's a terrific book called What It Means to Be Human. And the first couple of chapters really go through and set up his kind of view on things, and then he applies it to reproductive technologies and assisted suicide. Basically, he's arguing that the way in which the law is written is for the strong. It supports the strong. And that the problem is we are humans and we are all weak and dependent. And so the law is doing us a disservice ultimately, particularly in situations of reproductive technologies and assisted suicide. But he writes this: it's important to address a vulnerable and dependent population that is centrally involved in and affected by reproductive technologies, namely the living human embryos who are conceived, cultured, screened, transferred, intentionally destroyed, donated to other patients, and sold in batches to scientists for use and destruction in research, or most often, simply frozen indefinitely. And again, just to highlight the complicated nature of the embryo, there is clear evidence of internally directed coordinated activity from days 1 to 6 following fertilization. So the first 6 days, we know there is internally directed coordinated activity within the embryo. By virtue of its structure, function, and composition, the IVF embryo is a living human organism. I mentioned cryopreservation. The number of embryos can sometimes transferred can sometimes lead to the push for selective reduction. Clinics are able to run a whole slew of tests on embryos before they're transferred. These tests have been found to be fairly unreliable, and yet they're still relied on. And embryos that fail the tests are generally discarded. One of the kind of newer technologies is PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or genetic screening. So some people will select for sex for family balancing reasons. We have 3 boys. It's time to have a girl, so let's just choose the female embryo. People have done immunocompatibility. So if you've seen the movie or read the books, My Sister's Keeper, that is the premise of that book is that someone had a child so that it genetically would match a sick child that they already had so that that child could be a donor for the other child. 92% of IVF clinics offer pre-implantation screening of this sort, 92% of clinics. And then coming soon, gene editing. We've seen now, and there's an important distinction to be made. We've seen now the approval of one genetic editing treatment by the FDA back in December for sickle cell disease. This is a wonderful treatment. It's given to adults. So far, it will likely soon be available to a younger population, but it has no effect on their offspring. It's not something that's carried on. But if you start doing gene editing in embryos, that is something that is going to carry on to their descendants. So you might remember the case in China in 17, 18, He Jiankyu had a woman who gave birth to, there were 2 children who were born, and he had gone in and edited their genes so that they would be less susceptible to HIV because one of the parents had HIV. As it turns out, that same gene is also protective against malaria, and so they are less susceptible to HIV, but more susceptible to malaria now. But he went to prison because China officially frowned upon what he had done, but there is definitely a push to do gene editing in embryos, and that is very problematic in contrast to the treatments for like sickle cell disease. There's another one in trials right now there is a genetic marker that oils the tiny little hairs inside of our ears that allow us to hear. So it's a very small percentage of deafness that's caused by this single gene trait. And they have started doing some treatments in young children. I think the first candidate was about 8 years old to restore that function and give them hearing. And that's been highly successful. But again, being done after the embryonic stage is not something that then enters into the gene pool. And so not a problem. Now, I will say there are Christian arguments in favor of IVF, and I have put one of them on the sheet here, the Wayne Grudem article. It's interesting too, and I guess maybe Alcorn might be the exception, but I can find 2 boomers that three boomers, just as a generational reference point, who argue that IVF can be morally right for Christians. And I don't find hardly anybody in Gen X that argues that. Matt Anderson is, I guess he's a few years younger than I am, the biblical case against IVF from First Things. So I don't know what to make of that, if it's just my selection bias, but it's interesting. And we've seen this to some degree in the pro-life movement because now we have ultrasounds, we have 4D ultrasounds. Younger people tend to be much more easily convinced of the pro-life position because we just have so much better knowledge about early fetal development. I mentioned the Creighton method, CRMS. This is the standardized observation and charting of biological markers. We have a godson that was born through the Creighton method. His parents were having huge difficulties with getting pregnant. They did not want to pursue IVF. They found a doctor who was expert in the Creighton method, and they have a son, Charlie. It is a little bit more of an intense kind of thing because it does involve daily tracking of things like temperature and other things. It does fall to the woman primarily to track those things. But it is a method both for achieving and avoiding pregnancy because it really alerts you to when you're most fertile. It also, as I say, has this kind of whole health aspect to it that, our reproductive cells are not some discrete part of ourselves. They're part of our whole bodies. Just finally, just some practical tips. Be informed. So being here today, finding out about these things, finding out what it means to be infertile, finding out the statistics, be informed. Be sensitive. I mentioned miscarriage, the anniversaries of pregnancy loss. And then be supportive. An encouraging word goes a long way. Just acknowledging these are losses, these are painful, these are difficult times. So again, do we see our fertility as essentially a good gift from the Creator to be accepted, or do we see our fertility as a negative limitation? And again, just to kind of reiterate, let's talk about building a family rather than starting a family. Really give some deep thought to that. Take a look at the further reading. These are all article length, so that none of these are book length. And they do vary in length. But really give some consideration to what you believe about this, and then make that known to your congregation. I mean, if you're teaching on the Ten Commandments, if you're teaching on Hannah, there'd be all kinds of ways in which I think these come up. You're preaching through Proverbs. There are a number of ways these could come up in a sermon. For Sanctity of Life Sunday, which has just passed, it was in January, but that's another opportunity. Reach out to us at the center. We'll be happy to answer questions, provide more resources, try and direct you